Today, we're gonna make some basic beginner cutting boards. Even though these cutting boards are dead simple to make, you'll be able to sell them online at craft shows, to friends and family, wherever you want to sell your woodworking. Quick disclaimer, and then we're gonna get started. I am going to be using some pretty expensive tools in this video, but really, I believe you can make these cutting boards with just 3 power tools: a table saw, a planer, and a basic sander. You'll see me use a few other tools, but they're not necessary, and I'll talk more about that later. Let's get started. First up, we want to make sure that we select the right type of wood. Now, I like to use hardwood, so that rules out pine, spruce, cedar, any kind of softwoods, because this is a cutting board, people are gonna be chopping up veggies on it and stuff like that. I also like to look for a hardwood that has a tight grain pattern. If you have something with an open grain pattern like an oak, especially a red oak, it's gonna catch more water and bacteria in those pores. So for that reason, I like to stick with woods like black walnut, maple's really good, cherry's really good, woods like that. By the way, this is a great way to use up some scrap wood in your shop. The scrap wood that I'm using here, it's different thicknesses, different lengths, obviously different types of wood. I'm just kind of using this project to clean up my shop. Right here, I'm planing all of the strips so that they will have great joints with no gaps in between. If you use a board that has a slight bow in it, it can reveal a gap. For cutting up these strips, I'm using a saw stop cabinet saw, but you don't need a big fancy table saw like this. If you have a little job site table saw, I've seen people make beautiful cutting boards on a table saw that is not nearly as expensive as this one. So don't think, oh, I don't have a big fancy table saw. That's okay. You don't need it. You can do it with whatever table saw you have. Now for your cutting board, however wide you make these strips, that will determine the thickness of your cutting board. Right here, what I'm doing with mine is I'm making these strips 1 3/4 inch thick. Keep in mind that you will lose some thickness when you run this final cutting board through the planer. So if you're aiming for a board that you want the final thickness to be 1 3/4 inches, you might want to cut these strips 1 7/8 inches or something like that. For this glue up, I'm using Titebond 3. It is essential that you use a wood glue that is waterproof because this cutting board is gonna get washed. Also use a wood glue that is safe for indirect food contact, which this Titebond 3 is. If you don't have any Titebond 3, I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's not super expensive and you can pick up a bottle from the description if you want to. Make sure that you get plenty of squeeze out, or in other words, there's plenty of glue coming out all along each joint. This will make sure, once again, that you don't have any gaps in your final cutting board. I'm about to run these cutting board blanks through the planer, but I just want to point out something. You probably noticed that we have these jagged edges on the ends of the cutting board. We're going to correct that, of course, but I like to leave all of these jagged edges because what this will do is prevent snipe as it runs through the planer. If I have all of these cut to one length, the planer might chip away at the end of that cutting board. So if you leave all these long, it might chip away right here, but that's okay because we're gonna cut all this off anyway. So leave it longer for your planer, then we'll trim it down to size afterwards. Let's trim these boards up. What I'm about to do next on this cutting board is, hey buddy, what I'm about to do next on this cutting board is optional, but I'm gonna add a little chamfer bit along the edge to kind of give it a little profile. My dog Shiloh right here is wanting to join in. So this is totally optional. If you don't have a router, you don't have to do this step, but it does give it a really nice look. What I'm about to do with these cutting boards next might seem a little strange, but it'll make the final product much better. I'm gonna wet these down, not soak them, but I'm gonna wipe them down with a pretty wet cloth. What that's gonna do is raise the grain. If you think about wood grain like a bunch of straws, when those straws suck up water, they expand. And so even though I've already sanded this down, it's really smooth right now, when I wet it, it's gonna get rough again, and then I'll sand it again. And that way it'll stay smooth even when someone goes to rinse it off or wash it. It won't get coarse or anything like that. Let's do it. All right, so we have wet these boards down. They're really rough, but that's gonna raise the grain. And then once these dry, we'll go back and sand it, pop that grain, and it'll stay silky smooth for a very long time. In the meantime though, I'm going to work, so I'm gonna come back tomorrow and finish these things up. Quick tip on sanding. After you finish one grit, before you move on to the next grit, wipe down your workpiece with a dry cloth. What this is going to do is remove all of that dust that if it sits on your cutting board, it'll get swirled around with the finer grit of sandpaper, and it will leave these little very small swirl marks in your cutting board. That won't look good. So to get a better finish, in between each grit, wipe down your cutting board with a cloth. Okay, now for the fun part, we get to put the first coat of finish on these cutting boards. It's super important to use a food grade finish because these cutting boards are going to be exposed to food. What I like to use is this Watco butcher block finish. I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's a great finish that's not super expensive, kind of a just nice happy medium as far as that goes. I also like to use these finishing triangles. This cuts my finishing time in half because I can put a coat on one side and then flip the cutting board over and put a coat on the other side, but these tiny little tips won't leave any indentions. I will say though, whenever you're using these, start with the bottom side and then flip to the top side. So in case it does leave a mark, it's on the bottom of the cutting board. Let's go. The last step in the finishing process is to use this cutting board conditioner. This is from Howard's, I'll leave a link to it in the description, and it will give that cutting board a great feel. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, you might enjoy one of these two videos where I make epoxy cutting boards and ingrain cutting boards. Ton of fun, check them out.